George Soros and the far-left rhetoric of globalism, fueling unrest, glorifying terrorism, and marketing it as democracy written by Rhetoric, the billionaire's carefully cultivated image as a humanitarian conceals a network accused of regime change operations, terror-linked funding, and ideological engineering that blurs the lines between activism, manipulation, and geopolitical control. For most of the 20th century, propaganda signified deceit, manipulation, and moral corruption. In the 21st century, it has been reborn with a sophisticated gloss, sold as progressive, liberal, and even humanitarian. We now live in an age where narratives are the new weapons. Tyrannies and extremist regimes are whitewashed as misunderstood, while nations protecting their culture, faith, and sovereignty are vilified as authoritarian. The global left-liberal information complex works around the clock to amplify far-left causes and silence dissenting voices. Under the guise of freedom, it enforces ideological conformity. Few figures embody this duplicity more clearly than George Soros, the billionaire speculator and self-styled champion of open societies. Through his powerful open society foundations, Soros has poured billions into shaping politics, funding NGOs, and influencing media narratives across continents, all wrapped in the rhetoric of democracy and human rights. In country after country, his network has been accused of backing protest movements, destabilizing elected governments, and financing organizations that erode national institutions. His foundations are banned or heavily restricted in Russia, Hungary, Kazakhstan, and others. Yet Western media continues to portray him as a visionary philanthropist, dismissing critics as conspiracy theorists. Even major tech platforms appear complicit, sanitizing his controversies and curating favorable narratives. The Trump administration's Justice Department reportedly began investigating Soros's global network for possible political interference, an acknowledgement that his influence extends far beyond philanthropy. Behind the polished facade of benevolence lies an empire of ideological warfare, where moral language becomes a weapon to fracture sovereign nations from within. This article exposes Soros's sprawling machinery of influence, one that manipulates perception, subverts democracy, and quietly redefines global power under the banner of openness. Soros's early life under Nazi occupation. George Soros was born in Hungary to a well-to-do Jewish family. During World War II, the family concealed their identity and reportedly forged documents to pass as Christians. At 14, Soros was sent to live with a Hungarian government official who posed as his Christian grandfather. This period marked the beginning of an enduring controversy. As thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to death camps, Soros accompanied his godfather on official visits that involved the confiscation of Jewish property. This has led to allegations that Soros collaborated in these confiscations, claims he has consistently denied, asserting that he was merely a bystander and too young to fully grasp the situation. In a CBS interview first aired in the 1990s, Soros stated unequivocally that he felt no guilt about his role at that time, when asked directly about his feelings. The remark has continued to fuel criticism and debate over his actions and attitudes during one of history's darkest periods. From breaking banks to breaking nations, Soros is considered a notorious mastermind in manipulating currencies and disrupting economies. With a huge track record of making money through speculation in unstable currencies, Soros is known for impoverishing entire countries and attempting regime change across the world. Famously known as the man who broke the Bank of England, George Soros began his currency speculation business by betting against the British pound in 1992, making up to $2 billion in the trade, and forcing the British government to devalue the pound and withdraw from European Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM. He is also considered the mastermind of the Asian financial crisis that engulfed the economies of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea in the late 1990s. Soros had made bets against the currencies of Malaysia and Thailand in the run-up to the financial crisis. The then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad directly held him responsible for the crisis, accusing him of undoing decades of economic progress. Mahathir was a nationalist whom Soros was sharply critical of. In response to Mahathir's criticism, Soros responded by saying that Mahathir was a menace to his country. He also later called for Mahathir's removal. It's hard to fit George Soros into the traditional mold of a leftist. His initial philanthropic activities were instrumental in bringing down communism in Eastern Europe, a philosophy which apparently reminded him of the oppressive Nazi regime and the Stalinist communist oppression. However, looking at Soros's politics over the past couple of decades, he comes across as a far-left ideologue often supporting causes that fall at the nexus of the left-liberal, woke, radical Islamist ecosystem. Rejection of nationalism lies at the heart of George Soros's political philosophy. His idea of an open society, framed in the language of independent groups working for rights, equity, and justice, seems less about freedom and more about legitimizing external interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. It effectively celebrates a globalist monopoly of progressive elites who wield immense influence with little accountability, often disrupting economies, societies, and cultures, and at times even engineering regime changes. In essence, it represents the direct antithesis of nationalism. Many of George Soros's lectures, most of them recorded over a decade ago, are available online and offer a clear window into his political thinking. In these talks, Soros often presents concepts such as democracy, human rights, and free speech as being fundamentally at odds with nationalism, thereby constructing a moral rationale for external interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign nations. This framing has justified efforts to weaken or destabilize nationalist governments. The lectures also expose the underlying strategy visible today, how his philanthropic and social initiatives are used to craft targeted narratives, organize protests, and discredit political leaders and regimes in pursuit of a specific ideological agenda. While outlining his concept of open societies, George Soros referred to the 2004 U.S. presidential election, in which President George W. Bush was re-elected. In that lecture, he went so far as to question the judgment of American voters for re-electing their leader, a stance that appears deeply problematic, particularly in the context of what was presented as an academic discussion. This reflects a recurring pattern in Soros's approach, the weaponization of social and political issues while assuming a moral high ground to undermine nationalist governments. Soros has been consistently vocal in his disdain for nationalist leaders, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, often issuing barely veiled warnings about the need to unseat their administrations. In 2020, he even announced a $1 billion fund to combat what he called the spread of nationalism, underscoring the ideological hostility that defines his global agenda. Hungary's nationalist Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has long been a target of George Soros's criticism. Soros has accused him of creating a mafia state, describing it as a system that maintains the facade of democracy while rulers use the media and judiciary to enrich themselves and remain in power. A major flashpoint between the two has been Orbán's firm anti-immigration policies, which directly conflict with Soros's globalist vision. Orbán, in turn, has accused Soros and his vast network of seizing every possible opportunity to overthrow governments that resist immigration. In August 2024, the Hungarian Prime Minister went further, alleging that Soros's activities are part of a broader campaign to undermine European civilization and advance the Islamization of the continent. George Soros has also made several pointed remarks against the Modi government, often couched in the language of political concern but carrying an unmistakably hostile undertone. Following the Hindenburg Report's allegations against Indian industrialist Gautam Adani, Soros remarked that Prime Minister Narendra Modi would have to answer questions arising from the controversy. He further suggested that the stock market turbulence linked to the issue could trigger a democratic revival in India. Such statements were widely viewed as thinly veiled attempts to undermine India's elected leadership and interfere in the country's internal political discourse. In January 2023, Hindenburg Research, a short seller based in the U.S., published a report accusing Indian business tycoon Gautam Adani and his various businesses of engaging in manipulation of stocks and accounting irregularities. The Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, launched an investigation and recently gave Adani a clean chit. Development Fund, SEDF, had attempted to channel disguised donations to various NGOs in India, further raising suspicion of covert political interference under the veneer of philanthropy. There is also substantial evidence suggesting that George Soros's philanthropic and social initiatives have indirectly funded terror-linked networks and their apologists. A Politico investigation revealed that Soros was among the donors supporting groups behind the aggressive pro-Palestine demonstrations on U.S. university campuses during the Israel-Gaza conflict. The report detailed the network of organizations involved in these protests and traced their financial connections back to Soros's funding channels. According to the same report, Soros's foundation to promote open society donated $250,000 in 2022 to Education for Just Peace in the Middle East, an NGO affiliated with the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions (BDS) National Committee. This group has been repeatedly accused of promoting anti-Israel propaganda and, following the Hamas terror attacks of October 7, 2023, was reportedly involved in organizing pro-Hamas rallies. These revelations reinforce long-standing concerns that Soros's global network, often presented as a force for justice and democracy, has, in practice, enabled groups that justify or abet violent extremism under the guise of activism. According to a research report by the Capital Research Center, the Open Society Foundations have donated over $80 million since 2016 to groups with links to terrorism or extremist violence. The report names several U.S.-based organizations, including the Center for Third World Organizing, the Ruckus Society, and the Sunrise Movement, which supported an Antifa-affiliated campaign, in which activists currently face more than 40 domestic terrorism charges and 60 racketeering indictments. Soros's war on Hindu identity, an often overlooked aspect of Soros's funding activities, is his extensive support for the anti-Hindu ecosystem. Many projects backed by the Open Society Foundations either directly promote radical Islamist causes or strengthen the far-left, Islamist nexus, creating fertile ground for anti-Hindu narratives to flourish. Soros's rhetoric of human rights, open societies, and free speech aligns closely with the discourse of the far-left establishment, which is steeped in Hinduphobia, making him, in effect, a patron of various anti-Hindu actors. There is considerable evidence of the Open Society Foundation's role in funding the virulently Hinduphobic organization Equality Labs, which has weaponized caste narratives in the West to target the Hindu diaspora. A report by Disinfolab provides detailed insight into Equality Lab's funding network, revealing that it has been a key recipient of Open Society Foundation's grants since 2018. The same report also makes alarming revelations about the group's alleged links to individuals associated with radical Islamist networks targeting India, further suggesting that its rise was facilitated by the US-based, Pakistan-backed Jamaat-e-Islami network. Furthermore, George Soros has openly accused the Indian Prime Minister of transforming India into a Hindu nationalist state. Such assertions mirror the broader pattern of anti-Hindu rhetoric that dominates sections of the left liberal media, think tanks, and academia. In January 2020, while speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the billionaire philanthropist lamented the rise of nationalism in India, claiming that a democratically elected Narendra Modi is creating a Hindu nationalist state, imposing punitive measures on Kashmir, a semi-autonomous Muslim region, and threatening to deprive millions of Muslims of their citizenship. This statement reflected not only Soros's ideological bias, but also his willingness to frame India's internal policies through a distorted and selectively moral lens. Buying influence, shaping news. George Soros, either through direct investment or indirect narrative influence, wields significant sway over global elite media, both in shaping the discourse he creates around human rights, democracy, open society, freedom of speech, etc., and in shaping his own controversial image. Media reports highlight how the Soros Fund Management is becoming an increasingly key player in the radio segment. In February 2024, the company reportedly became the biggest shareholder in Odyssey, the second largest radio company in the U.S., with more than 230 U.S. stations. According to a report by the New York Post, Soros's purchase of a large swathe of Odyssey radio stations right before the elections was under investigation by lawmakers. George Soros doesn't own any of the elite media houses directly. Most funding is indirect, through grants, aid, and other forms of sponsorship provided by the Open Society Foundations and his other organizations. Therefore, it's hard to establish quantifiable evidence regarding Soros's funding of media organizations. However, a report by the US-based Media Research Center offers fascinating insight into the billionaire philanthropist's tight grip on the elite left-liberal media and exposes how he controls the news agenda of elite media organizations worldwide. The elite Western media indeed portrays Soros as the hapless victim of the right wing and debunks most allegations against him. Most mainstream Western media reports on Soros seem exaggeratedly biased, with the viewpoint from the other side rarely included. The elite media coverage of Soros also conveniently ignores all evidence against his activities, dismissing all criticism of his activities as conspiracy theories. Global pushback against Soros from the US to Hungary and India, nationalist governments across the world are strongly resisting George Soros's global oligarchy game. In the US, an investigation is being launched into his network and activities. Top federal prosecutors at U.S. attorneys' offices have already received a directive to be prepared to launch investigations into Soros's Open Society foundations. Prosecutors were reportedly considering several potential charges against Soros, including material support to terrorism, wire fraud, racketeering, and arson. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has vowed to shield Europe from Soros's overreach, declaring that he will not allow the continent to become a playground for Soros-led NGO networks. His remarks came in the context of the Trump administration's crackdown on USAID-funded initiatives, which he viewed as part of the same global apparatus of political interference. In light of Soros's repeated intrusions into India's internal affairs, the Indian government has strongly condemned his actions, accusing him of attempting to influence internal affairs and engineer regime change under the guise of philanthropy. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has also criticized Soros, calling out the hypocrisy of the global establishment. She noted that tech entrepreneur Elon Musk is labeled a disruptor simply for holding right-of-center views, while Soros, who routinely interferes in other nations' democracies, faces little scrutiny because his ideology aligns with the left-liberal order that dominates international media, academia, and policymaking circles. Wrapping up the lofty rhetoric of globalism and open societies conceals a darker reality, one defined by extremism, instability, and mounting human rights abuses. Ironically, the very human rights that globalists claim to defend are now endangered by the unholy alliance of left-liberal, woke, and radical Islamist forces that they so eagerly empower. As the growing tide of Hinduphobia demonstrates, communities lying outside the approved boundaries of globalist ideology remain targets of hatred, prejudice, and discrimination. At the forefront of this disturbing phenomenon stands George Soros, the self-anointed champion of open societies and, paradoxically, the architect of their unraveling.